Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is lecture 3 of the O-Levels English language course. The course code is 1123 and the course is presented by Nafi' Academy. My name is Ibrahim Ahsan and I am the English language instructor and trainer at Nafi' Academy. And in today's session, we will be talking in detail about informal letter writing. And we will talk a bit about formal letter writing as well. And we will revisit some of the aspects of formal letter writing. So let's get into it. Now, informal letter writing has guidelines as well, and they are almost the exact opposite of formal letter writing. Of course, in an informal letter you do need to follow standard English, and your grammar needs to be accurate and your spellings need to be correct as well. But it's a bit more lenient in terms of the style and tone than the formal letter. Now, an informal letter is a letter that is usually written to a close relative or a friend. And in this particular letter, you address the recipient by their first name. So you can say, Dear Ahmed, or Dear Abdullah. And you can end with something like, with love, for example, something more informal. Or anything along the lines of that. And in this particular letter, you can use some slang words like what's up, how are you doing, for example. And you can also use contractions. So you can use the short form. So for example, instead of saying cannot, you can say can't. And instead of saying I have not, you can say I haven't. And so on and so forth. Now, this is the page number 150 from your textbooks, and it details some of the points that you need to remember in relation to formal and informal letter writing. And these particular pages are quite important to understand, and so we will go through them quickly, and I will comment wherever the commentary is needed. So it says, examination directed writing questions may ask you to write a letter that could be either formal or informal. So you will either get the option to write a formal or an informal letter, and this will be hinted at in the question. So if they ask you to write to a friend, you know it's informal. If they ask you to write to an organization, then you know that it's a formal letter. The following points should help with how to approach answering in this genre. Now, number 1, when writing a letter, either formal or informal, as part of an examination question, you will not be expected to include any address, either yours or the recipient's, at the head of the letter, so you don't need to worry about this or how to format it. It is likely that the instructions on the question paper will tell you how to begin the letter. For example, begin your letter to the newspaper with Dear Editor. So this particular paragraph includes two important points. Number 1, whether you're writing a formal or an informal letter, you do not need to include any address, whether it's your address or the recipient's address, recipient being the person you are writing to. You don't need to include any address. And the second important point in this is that the instructions on the question paper will tell you, perhaps not always, but at times they will tell you how to begin the letter. So an example is given here where the question says, begin your letter to the newspaper with Dear Editor. So it tells you specifically how to begin your letter. Point number 2. A formal letter is one that is written either to someone whom you do not know well or to something such as an organization, company, or newspaper. It is likely to be concerned with putting forward ideas, making a complaint, or requesting a particular service. So, who are you writing the formal letter to? The audience of the formal letter is different than the audience of the informal letter, like we have already mentioned. And the purpose of writing a formal letter could be perhaps you're giving a suggestion, or you're making a complaint, or you're requesting a particular service, or anything along the lines of that. Point number 3. Unless you are advised otherwise, a formal letter should begin with the salutation, "Dear sir" or "Dear madam." Now, sometimes in a formal letter, they might tell you specifically how to begin with. So, for example, here they said, "Dear editor." If they don't tell you, then you begin, and this is a formal letter, then you begin with "Dear sir" or "Dear madam." And you should conclude the letter with something like "Yours faithfully" or "Yours truly," followed by your full name. So when you're ending the letter, you're done with the conclusion, you write "Yours faithfully," and then at the bottom you write your full name. Then it says, it may also be necessary to put a brief heading at the start of the letter after the salutation if it is important to refer to the topic about which you are writing. For example, re here means regarding. Item lost on number 37 bus. So this could be something beneficial. Now this does not mean that you put a subheading before every paragraph. No, that's not how you write a letter. But after the salutation, which is "Dear sir" or "Dear madam," you can write regarding whatever the topic of the letter is, and then continue with your letter. I repeat, the different paragraphs should not have different subheadings. This is the only part where you're allowed to add something like this. Point number 4. A formal letter should be written in a formal tone, so you should avoid colloquialism and contractions like we mentioned. However, it is not necessary to use business jargon such as inst and alt, as this is likely to obscure your purpose and also look unnecessarily stilted. It is important that such a letter is clearly focused and logically structured through paragraphs. So be careful. Don't just write in big chunks. Make sure you separate the letter through paragraphs. So introduction is one paragraph, and then the body has different paragraphs, and the conclusion is a separate paragraph. Alright. Make sure that what you have written is very clear and you have expressed your ideas clearly. Number 5, they've mentioned, it is not usually appropriate to inquire after the recipient's health when writing a formal letter, like we mentioned. In an informal letter, when you're writing to a friend or a close relative, you ask about their health. But in a formal letter, when you're writing to a stranger, someone you don't know well, or an organization, then you are not supposed to ask about their health. Then, a letter to someone who you know, but who you would be expected to treat with some respect, such as a teacher or an elderly neighbor, should also be fairly formal in tone. It should begin by addressing the recipient either by their title, so "Dear Headmaster," or their formal name, like "Dear Mr. O'Grady," not with their first name. It should conclude with "Yours sincerely," followed by your full name. This would be appropriate, for example, if you were writing to Mr. O'Grady, who is a teacher at your school, asking him to provide you with a reference for a part-time job. Right, so when you're writing to a teacher or an elderly neighbor, you either address them by their title or their formal name, which is their last name, not their first name. And you conclude the letter with "Yours sincerely," and after that you write your full name. Moving on. An informal letter is one written to a relative or friend. It is likely to contain personal information. For example, you may be writing to your grandmother to tell her about a school festival in which you took part. This is fairly clear. Then point number 7, I think it's point number 7, it says you should begin an informal letter by addressing the recipient by name. So in an informal letter, when you're writing to a friend or a close relative, you begin by their first, by their names. For example, dear Granny, referring to grandmother, or dear Lee, or like we said, dear Ahmed, dear Abdullah, for example. There are no hard and fast rules as to how you conclude an informal letter, but your valediction should be in keeping with how familiar you are with the person to whom you are writing. So in a formal letter, you end with something like yours faithfully, yours truly. There's a standard. But in an informal letter, there is no standard. It depends on your relation. So if it's someone you're very close to, you can say something with love. So for example, your grandmother. Or for someone else, like a friend, you can say with all best wishes, and so on and so forth. And then you write your first name only, not your full name. Also, you cannot end an informal letter with something like yours sincerely. It is not appropriate. Then it mentions, it is acceptable to use colloquialism and contractions in an informal letter, although you should not overdo them or fall into extreme teenage slang or text language. So you should write in standard English, but you can use some slang. However, don't write in WhatsApp language, for example. Don't write wrong spelling. So for example, you cannot write, I'm gonna do this. No, you have to write, I am going to, for example. Right? And you should not overdo this in terms of extreme teenage slang or something like that. You should not overdo that. Keep it in standard English, but at some places you can use colloquial language, or colloquialism, or slang. And you can use contractions, generally speaking. Finally, although it is important to keep clearly in mind the purpose for which you are writing the letter, and to ensure that your answer is clearly structured and written in paragraphs, it is also acceptable to include some personal concerns, such as inquiring about how other members of the recipient's family are getting on, and so on, as long as this does not detract from the overall purpose of the letter. It is best not to use such phrases as, I hope you are all in the pink of health. However, as such expressions are now outdated and no longer in common English usage. Now, what they're reminding you here is that you need to make sure still that you are writing based on the purpose of the letter, and you're keeping to the topic. You're not moving away from the topic. But it's fine if you move a little bit at one instance, for example, or two instances, very briefly, ask about someone's family or something like that, but then you get back to the topic. Make sure you stick to the purpose of the letter and to the main topic, and make sure you use terms that are not outdated. Use phrases that are used in common English today. And with that, we end lecture 3 of the O-Levels English Language course. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.